We often hear the phrase, children are our future. Yet children in more recent times have become more of a vulnerable group, with more cases than ever being reported on child abuse and risk factors linked with the online world. To discuss this, we have two organizations that work with children's rights. Number one is UNICEF, represented by their Pacific Island country representative, Mr. Sheldon Yet, and Save the Children Fiji, represented by their project manager, Ms. Amita Prasad. Good evening and welcome, both of you, to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So let's start off the discussion with the online aspect of our show today. Before that, just as a matter of context, what does UNICEF do to work with children's rights in Fiji?
Well, UNICEF is guided by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And we're just about to celebrate the 30th anniversary of this extremely important UN convention. And Fiji ratified it in 1993. We work with the government of Fiji to ensure that their laws, the policies, the strategies that are in place in this country are in line with the UN Convention. We work in sectors such as health, education, child protection, immunization, nutrition, really all the areas that touch on a child's life.
And does Save the Children Fiji do something similar?
Yes, so Save the Children has been in Fiji for the last 40 years, and we are a non-government children's organization. So like Mr. E said, our work is also guided by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and we have a different programmatic focus. So our sectors also are child rights and protection, child participation, health, education, child censorship, livelihoods as well.
Mm-hmm. So getting to the aspect of online safety for children, you recently spoke with the media about this, that children are especially vulnerable through online cyberbullying. Talk to us about that.
Well, kids are getting online at a very fast pace. You know, I don't know about your household, I know in my household, my kids know far more about computers and far more about what's out there on their iPhone or on their computer than I do. That's good because they're curious, they're engaged, they're online, they're exploring. But there are also risk elements there as well. Kids, of course, don't have the same kinds of experiences that you and I have. They are curious, but they take risks. They sometimes go into sites that may not be appropriate. They sometimes they are at risk for being lured into areas that may be dangerous to them, areas that may subject them to harassment, to abuse. So we need to take measures to make sure that doesn't happen. I think the best measure is making sure that there's good parenting, that there's good monitoring of what kids are doing, knowing that what your child is doing online, understanding the basics, making sure that parental sites and parental safeguards are in place on computers. These kinds of things help. But we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. Computers and the internet are fantastic tools for allowing a child, a young person, to explore his curiosity, to learn, to go to university sites all over the world, to learn, to allow him or her to follow his favorite sports team or favorite hobby. But we have to be careful. We have to work with that child.
Now, in the Pacific context, it seems like we're moving away from a communal way of living and a communal way of rearing a child. It's no longer, it takes a village to raise a child. You're seeing nuclear families popping up everywhere. There's a more concern about parents not being able to spend enough time with their children to teach them values. This is where both organizations come in to sort of foster the needs for the child. Of course, one of them being the right to proper education and also to healthcare. Tell us more about the work that Save the Children Fiji does.
So when it comes to healthcare of children, we know we work with a lot of partners as well. Apart from the work that we do, we work around 52 communities in Fiji, but we have recently also started working in the coastal areas of around 10 communities there, and also as far as Koro Island. So for us to work with our partners for healthcare and support, there are different initiatives that are available by the government. So when we go out in the communities, we are doing work for children. We also encourage these communities and the children to be able to access those assistance that are offered by the government. But for education specifically, we don't have any programming on education right now. But during the beginning of every year, we have lots of requests for school stationery support, school bag kits. So this year alone, Save the Children assisted 1,520 children. We received applications from various children and their parents around the country, and we, through support from private sector organizations, we were able to support children with their school bag kits.
So you work quite closely in those communities. What are some of the difficulties that you think that children face in those areas when it comes to actually accessing them, maybe voicing their concerns regarding these issues?
I think at the communal setting, like you said, when it comes to empowering children to voice their opinions, maybe there's one challenge there, because not in all remote communities children are allowed freely to voice their opinions on issues that affect them. But Save the Children, while we work for children, we work with children as well. So we have a child-led initiative known as KidsLink Fiji, and this is the platform where we really get children to advocate and come strongly on issues that affect them. So we, through our disaster risk reduction programming, we also have established 30 children's clubs around the country. So this is the medium through which we allow children in the communities also to voice out their opinions on issues that affect them, such as its disaster or any other issue, child abuse, sexual abuse. So what do they want? And we have also conducted children's forums in the past, and the children got together and developed manifestos. So in that manifestos, they said these are the issues that we are being affected by, and these are the things that we want to be addressed. And those manifestos were presenting up to the ministerial level.
So both groups work a lot with children, especially at the grassroots level. In UNICEF's experience, when you go out to these communities, you know, it's often said that the gap in information and knowledge is being closed through the online world. Do you see a lot of positive change that's being led by more accessibility to the internet, more accessibility to technology, especially in Fijian communities?
Absolutely. But of course, these things are a double-edged sword. There is better access to information, but as you and I both know, not all the information on the internet is correct. It's factual. It's really important that children are guided to the information they're receiving, that they were still working with their teachers, their parents, and others to sift the information and to determine fact from fiction. So yes, there's a lot out there, but we have to be careful to make sure that the right information is getting and is being used by students, is being used by communities, is being used in the schools.
So even accessibility and accessing such a forum in the right context is really important.
Yes.
I'll give you a personal example. When I was in high school just a few years ago, not more than a decade ago, having access to the computer lab, which was only one lab for you know, the whole school, it was a privilege to have access to the computer lab. So outside of school, you have more accessibility because a lot of parents have access to smartphones at home. You might have a PC. So is that a good thing, not having access to technology openly in a school setting?
Well, I think the genie's out of the bottle, right? I mean, you can't lock up all the phones and all the computers. There are computers or ways of getting on the internet everywhere. And I think it's a fool's errand to prevent children from doing that. And we shouldn't do that. We just need to make sure that children feel free to talk to us, to talk to their teachers, to talk to community leaders, to talk to people they trust, and that they're guided in what they do online, that they're supported to go to the right sites to get the kind of information, and that there's open discussion between the kids about what they're seeing, what they're hearing, sites they're accessing. That's what's important here. Yes, we need to make sure children have a voice and children feel comfortable talking about what they're seeing and hearing online.
We'll have more for you right after the break. We were discussing, Mr. Yet, children's safety online. And in more recent times, one of the issues that has come out, especially with social media, is the issue of accountability for content that should or should not be regulated online. And children, of course, become a very important part of that discussion because of the stuff that they are exposed to. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think providers have to be held to account. Information is not kept under lock and key. It gets out and it's circulated and it's changed and it's interpreted. So if anyone's putting something online, I think they have a responsibility to make sure that information is correct, that information is not harmful to groups of people, to individuals, and to others. But again, we do need to recognize that the internet is an extremely useful tool for expanding information, expanding knowledge. It's with us. We need to work with it. And we need to ensure that those who are online are responsible by what they're saying and what they're doing.
Right.
Now, talk to us about how important it is for parents, especially new parents, to drive home the message that just because information is out there does not mean that children are readily entitled to it. Now, this, of course, is a contentious point, given that children nowadays are saying, well, it's happening overseas. They can watch these games. They can play these things. Why can't we do it?
Mm-hmm. So I think basically in the home environment, like Mr. E said, it's all about supervising. So if your child is exposed to online materials, if they are present online on the different social media platforms, it becomes your responsibility as parents, as guardians, as caregivers to ensure that you monitor what children are watching. So we cannot stop children from accessing information, but of course that information has to be appropriate in due accordance to the age and maturity of children.
There's also instances where we've noticed things being circulated online. Maybe parents or guardians or even family members and friends are not aware of the violations of children's rights. Say, for example, when a child is, misbehaving, they tend to do this new thing, which is naming and shaming children online, taking pictures of them or taking videos of them being disciplined, and that leads to them being victimized in schools or within their peer group.
It's all about raising awareness to children, how they can become more responsible when they are online. So it's about creating that social boundaries, educating children about those social boundaries. For instance, what sort of information do they put about themselves online? If it's too much of private information or their personal photos, that could be the risks levels can be increased. So what sort of information they make available about themselves? Sometimes when they are visiting certain places, they just post a picture with the location on, and there are perpetrators out there. So the risk level heightens. So we need to ensure and educate our children the type of information. What is the social boundary when you are in the online space? What sort of information should you access and what shouldn't you access, and what information about yourself you are putting out there so that you are not putting yourself into risky situations.
Let's put a slight pin in the online discussion and just slightly take a tangent onto the challenges that children are facing right now. Now, moving away from online safety and online behavior, what are some of the challenges that you've picked out children in the Pacific, especially in Fiji, face on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I think it's very difficult to generalize. Children in upper middle class families in Suva are facing very different kinds of difficulties than a child in a remote island in the Lao group. And those challenges that child is facing are going to be different from the challenges a child in Malaita province in the Solomon Islands. So all challenges are local. All children have specific challenges based on their own community. What we are seeing is issues in Fiji are similar to the rest of the Pacific. Children from upper income communities have access to good schooling, good sanitation, good health care. Those in poorer communities and more rural communities, less so. I think the issue is equity. How do we target the most disadvantaged? How do we get resources to those who may not have that? How do we ensure that schooling is just as good for a child in a remote community as it is for a child in an upper income community in Denarau or in Suva or any place else? I think that's what the challenge is. All children are guaranteed, and should be guaranteed, the same rights under the Convention of the Rights of a Child. So we need to work with government and with community groups and with others to ensure that all children do have access to health care, education, protection, and all the other rights guaranteed under the CRC. We
have seen a few plus points, though, one of them being that there's not much exploitation of children when it comes to child labor.
Indeed, that is an issue. But there isn't a country in the world that is perfectly immune to these issues. Fiji has issues like this, just as any other country does. Again, the vulnerability depends upon the background of the child and where that child is.
In the work that you have done in your various groups with communities, what would you say is the current level of opportunities given to traditionally disadvantaged groups? Let's say, for example, if a child is living away from a more centralized area, do they have the same levels of access to information, to education in Fiji?
I think education is okay because schools are everywhere, and Ministry of Education has a number of initiatives. Free bus fare scheme, the fees is free, and it's accessible to all children in Fiji, everywhere. But maybe, as Mr. E said, in terms of equity, when it comes to those advantages that the central children have, do those same advantages exist for rural children? For instance, maybe accessing things online for their research or for their schoolwork. Not all children in the remote areas might have that opportunity. And there would be more opportunities for children in the central division to voice out their opinion, but we NGOs, when we work in remote communities, we ensure that it's our duty to bring those voices to the national level to ensure that that is addressed at some point in time.
Mr. Yap?
Indeed, I think that children in rural areas and remote communities often don't have the same opportunity, in part because there are often not as many community resources in those areas. But there's some basic things I think we can do. We need to ensure that the first 1,000 days of a child's life are being catered for, that we're doing simple things like promoting exclusive breastfeeding, good nutrition, good protection, good active engaged parenting. These things don't necessarily take money. They take knowledge, and they take engaged community leaders, and most importantly, engaged parents.
Looking at the children's welfare, something that new parents are taking into account, the old adage of spare the rod, spoil the child, is not being taken, not too lightly and not too heavily either, but more of a balanced approach. Do you see this changing across the board in Fiji in different communities, or is it only in certain classes?
This change comes slowly. There is unfortunately too much bullying, too much physical discipline of children. We know that that does not have positive effects. We know that's a violation of a child's rights. Yes, there are laws in place. Yes, there are policies in place. But in Fiji, like any other place in the world, application of the laws and application of policies varies. It is essential, though, that we hold teachers and principals and others accountable for this. Children should not be beaten. Physical violence has a tremendously negative impact on a child's welfare.
We'll be right back after a break. Welcome back. Ms. Prasad, we were talking about accessibility to resources in the last segment. Just carrying on from that, what's your assessment of things like sanitation and access to clean water, access to proper nutrition and healthcare in some areas of Fiji?
I think from our programming perspective, we do WASH. We have WASH programming as well. So promoting hygiene practices and water and sanitation in schools. Yeah, but in some areas, I think the practice in the communities, it's there. It's been there, but for us to really raise awareness and advocate to children on the hygiene practices, water and sanitation is really important, and that's one area in which we focus on, and we work with schools and communities.
And UNICEF does a lot of work in that area.
Yeah, maybe I could say something about that, because on paper, Fiji is doing really, really well on that. 9 out of 10 schools have access to water and sanitation. But when you break it down a little bit, the numbers aren't quite as good. Just because there's a pipe going into the school, just because there's a toilet there, doesn't mean the pipe is actually working. Doesn't mean the taps are working. Doesn't mean that the toilet is accessible. It doesn't mean it's clean. It doesn't mean kids are using it. So what we've started together with our partners with the Ministry of Education is a 3-star approach, making sure that communities are taking charge of water and sanitation in their schools, and that communities understand the importance of it. That they are making sure that toilets are functioning, that they're clean, that there's facilities for girls as well as for boys, that there's good hygiene practices, that hand washing is being encouraged. So schools move up the ladder. They take charge of it, put resources in place, and bring in the PTO, bring in parents' organizations, bring in community organizations. It becomes a community responsibility, and that's really taken off. And it's a model that Fiji has pioneered, and it's expanding to elsewhere in the Pacific too. We're really excited about it and really pleased with the benefits it's brought to schools and to communities, and most importantly, to the health of children.
And it involves, in fact, things that some of us in the urban areas take for granted. So how does that impact the life of a child when at an early age they have access to these things, when they're taught about at a very young age, even something as basic as washing your hands with soap and water?
It's fundamental. Basic habits start at a very early age. Those really cute songs that kids, sing in school, wash my hands,
Right.
wash my hands, it makes a difference. It ingrains a behavior, and the kids pass on these behaviors to others. You have to start young. And it's, as we know, basic sanitation, basic hygiene that makes such a tremendous difference on the health and welfare of a child, health and welfare of a family.
Do you agree?
Yes, I do agree with him. So it starts with children at a very young age. And like he said, if you start it with songs or in creative ways, some children do drawing, some also create posters. And what we encourage children when it comes to hygiene practices, so for children to become hygiene promoters in schools and in their communities. So once they learn it, then they go and promote hygiene practices in their own communities to adults and to their parents.
That's right. I mean, kids learn from each other. I think that's the most important thing. Peer teaching
Right.
is a lot more powerful than a person in a lab coat and a fancy tie and a stern face saying, "You must wash your hands."
Right.
Kids listen to their friends. We need to make sure that leaders in schools and leaders among kids are doing the right things and bringing others on board.
There's also the safety component that comes into play. Of course, you can advocate for health as well, but looking at safety, some things that we do not consider. We send children off to school thinking that you'll have guardians who are teachers, facilitators over there that'll keep an eye on them. But then they get involved in a few accidents here and there. They may run across the road anyhow. How do you counter that? How do you make sure that children are aware of their own safety instead of relying on others?
So I think when they are in school, if you talk about school, I think the duty of care is there. So they are, the teachers are there for their welfare. Parents might not be there, but also they are school leaders, and children themselves, they have to taught about the protective behaviors. So when the road safety is important. So when you cross the road, and I know when every morning and every afternoon when children are accessing school or coming out from school, there are road safety rules. So they have leaders who make them cross the roads, ensure that children only cross when the vehicles stop. So teaching those safety habits into children, it's important.
Yes, but again, it comes to the role of parents. Parents have to be involved, engaged in their child's lives all the time and as much as possible. Parents grow that way, and most importantly, children do too.
But there's also this aspect where parents sort of rely on others, those who are educators, saying that it's not my responsibility, I'm sending my child to school, you need to teach them things. Yet children learn a certain behavior, and then they come home, and then they see things that are to the contrary. How do you counter that? They're being taught one thing in school, which is, of course, for their welfare and safety, but then at home, those who are supposed to nurture them are teaching them something that's completely different.
Again, I think it goes to peer pressure and involving others. One of the things that we have found most successful is community councils and PTOs, making sure they're involved, making sure that other parents are talking to other parents, that village leaders and community leaders are holding other parents accountable, making sure the right things are happening. You're quite right that often parents provide a poor example for behavior, but that's why we need other parents involved as well. As I say, no man is an island. You have to work at a broader community.
Let's move on to something that the entire nation of Fiji is grappling with, and that is sexual abuse against children. I personally don't think that it's a matter of more instances of sexual abuse happening, rather more instances of it being reported. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so recently we did a press release and the current stats that has been released by the Office of the Director of Public Prosecution, so that shows a growing epidemic of sexual offences against children. And in March alone, 60% of sexual abuse that was committed or that was reported was against children. And in 2018, there were 195 cases, out of which most of it was offences that were committed against children. So we know, as you said, it could be because more and more cases are being reported because of the awareness raising and all the advocacy that has taken place. But it's still a concern that if you look at the perpetrator profile side, I'm not saying that it could be true. We need to have more research looking into the perpetrator profiling or more information being made available. But in most of the cases where sexual offences have been committed against children, it's committed by somebody who is known to the child. So it's somebody, it's basically one of us living in that same home, living in that same society, in that same community.
Right.
And it becomes our duty, our responsibility as adults to address these issues, but also it's our responsibility to protect our children and to nurture them and to care for them, love them. But in those same homes, these children are being sexually abused, which is not appropriate.
We'll discuss more about this because it is a very big issue, but all of that right after the break. Welcome back. When we left off, we spoke about the fact that many victims of child abuse personally knew the perpetrator, and this has been found out in so many cases. Do you think that children are safe in their own homes, Mr. Yed?
Are children safe in their own homes? Well, yes, 99.9% of children are safe in their own homes. 99.9% of parents are good parents. But of course, there are cases where this happens. And the situation here in Fiji is no different in that respect than the situation it is in Chicago or in Wellington or in Brussels. It's people that are known to the family. It's people close to the family. There's always this idea that it's strangers, it's some masked crusader coming into the village. That's often not the case. That's very rarely the case. It is often someone that the family already knows, and that makes it even more difficult.
Now, Amita, there is this misconception, though, that children who have been abused, who have been victimized in these horrendous cases, that it was all one-off. But of course, as you know, that is definitely
Sometimes
not the case. They're groomed,
yes, they're
to a
groomed.
particular point.
Yeah, or it happens a number of times, and the children are threatened, so they are not able to speak up, or they are not sure what's happening, and they are not properly cared for, guided by the parents or caregivers, and they are unable to, because they are so frightened, they are unable to, so it continues.
I think it's really important that we talk about this issue.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that these numbers seem to be going up, but the fact is we don't know if that's really the case. We don't know. More people are just more comfortable bringing it forward, talking to authorities. So in that respect, that's a good thing. We want people to be comfortable reporting this to the police, reporting it to those people who need to know, those people who can make a difference and can stop it. It's a tough conversation to have. Parents are often reluctant to do that because of the mutual obligations that small communities often have on individuals have on each other. But it's essential. The impact on a child is devastating, and that's why we must bring it to the surface.
When we discuss these things, there's often a mention of the phrase, the cycle of abuse. Talk to us about that.
I think the cycle of abuse, because if children are threatened, then it continues and continues and
As in
continues.
the victim becomes the perpetrator,
Right.
and so on and so
Yes.
forth, because it's all
some
repressed.
in some cases, yeah.
I see.
But if you look at some cases that have been prosecuted, it happened a number of times. The sexual abuse continued till the time when it was reported It happened so many times, then it got reported.
But this is where follow-up becomes essential. This is where you need to come in with therapy. You need to come up with plans to ensure that they are comfortable to talk about their experiences and to carry on with them in a positive way. And also, what kind of work does UNICEF or even Save the Children Fiji do to sort of, reinforce the idea that this is not right, that you should not be subjected to this?
I think advocacy, it all starts at home, but are we teaching children about protective behaviors? And in Fiji, I think our culture is such, we have the taboo culture, and one of the challenges of sex crimes is that we are not openly talking about it. But it's a time now that we must have these strong conversations at homes, in our communities, in our churches, in our temples, about sexual abuse. Of course, in due accordance to children's age and maturity, but we have to have honest conversations so that we are strongly instilling the protective behaviors in children for them to be able to speak out, but also if they see that somebody is doing something to them where they don't feel comfortable or it's not an appropriate behavior, then they must just report to someone. And it's also about building that trust. So are we empowering our own children in our own homes? Because if we say that children are being abused in the homes, what are we doing in the homes to ensure those protective behaviors are being built up into children?
Sheldon, tell us about when an act of a nature like this, sexual abuse happens in the house for a victim. Straight off, what are the rights of the child that are violated? Because for someone who may be perpetrating these acts, they may not be aware of exactly what it is they're doing, because it takes a pretty warped mind to commit such horrendous acts. But what happens to the child? How many rights are they being deprived of in an instant like that?
Well, I think it's not a question of the number of rights. It's a question of the cascading effect of something like this. These are crimes, and individuals who are perpetrating these kinds of acts need to be held fully to account for what they've done. But the impact, it can be on a child's schooling, the right to education, child's health, child's well-being, and it can go on for years and years and years. It's a cost not just to that individual child, and not just to that family, but to society as a whole. That's why it's so important that people feel confident enough to talk about it, to make sure children are talking openly about it, that community members are talking openly about it in church and in temples and in schools, and that people are held accountable for what they've done.
And, when we're having this conversation, it's also important to consider what happens to the victim after the trauma. Yes. Something as simple as, for example, that child being required to testify in court. There's a lot of work that also needs to be done to ensure that once they're in the justice system, that their rights are still protected and they're still, treated as a child. Does UNICEF or Save the Children Fiji do work on that aspect?
We do. We work with the justice system to protect the rights of children in contact with the law. Children who are either victims or children who actually have been responsible for or been accused of offenses themselves. The right to privacy is there, the right for a child not to be traumatized a second time by having to recount what happened in an open setting, the right for the sensitive questioning by the judge, by the magistrate. All these things are extremely important. And we're working with the judicial sector here, and we're also working with experts, bringing experts from other countries who can share best practices. And I'm very pleased to say that there's commitment and things are moving in the right direction here.
And what about Save the Children Fiji?
I think we also work with partners to ensure that children's rights are protected when it comes to, but also when you look at the laws, when you look at the judiciary, I think the cases that are reported, it's good to see. We really applaud the work that is done by the courts, Fiji courts, because in comparison to before, the reported cases that are coming to courts now or are being prosecuted, it's good to see that there has been increased on the sentencing tariffs, unlike before. So each case is different, but you can see that the courts are really serious. When any sexual abuse is reported by children, it's thoroughly investigated and it goes to the courts, and higher tariffs are provided now.
We'll be back with the final segment right after this. welcome back. Let's talk about early childhood. Recently, all around the world, in fact, there's a lot of focus on the first few years of a child's life. Why is that, and what work is UNICEF doing in early childhood?
You know, over the last couple of years, there's been tremendous scientific advancement about learning what happens in a child's brain. And what we've learned is that the synapses, the connections in a child's brain are growing at an astronomical rate. And we've also learned that if a child is going to ensure those synapses actually grow into a neural network, we need to make sure that the child is stimulated, that responsive caregiving is in place, and nutrition programs are in place. The first couple of years of a child's life are absolutely essential. And investing in those years can have an amazing return on investment later on. Some studies have shown that $1 spent then can lead to a $13 return on investment. Just because the importance of early play, early stimulation, good nutrition has such a long-term return. It's essential. People like to talk about investing in university education. They like to talk about investing in fancy laboratories, but it's really the early investments that matter most.
And for Save the Children, we have done a lot for early childhood education. So previously we have established early childhood education centers, 52 of those in informal settlements around Fiji. So to ensure that children are able to access that quality education at an early age, which is really the building blocks of them accessing education, which would build a foundation for them to proceed to primary education.
And in fact, it becomes more relevant when you talk about Fiji, because it's still a challenge, early childhood,
That's right.
in more disenfranchised communities. And we spoke earlier on about how, the cycle of poverty sort of reinforces itself in something as simple as nutrition
That's right.
given to a child in a rural area compared to the nutrition that a child has available in a more centralized area.
That's exactly right. And we know that structured, organized pre-primary services have a tremendous return on a child's ability to make the most of the education facilities and education that's offered in primary and secondary school. We know from studies globally that children who have access to quality pre-primary education do much better later on in life, do better in secondary education and in university education, and of course are able to return more to their society, to their country afterwards when they have a paying job as a newscaster or as a president or an MP or anything else that they may happen to be.
Let's look at something that sometimes we tend to forget while we're focusing on the needs of a child, also the need for a child to experience childhood in its best. Because while we may provide all the healthcare and all the sanitation, all the educational needs, sometimes we tend to leave that one very crucial aspect on the side. Tell us about what you see happening in the future for children in Fiji.
I think it all starts from the home again, when it comes to parents. What are we doing in the homes to empower the children are at least, accessing their basic rights. So when it comes to them experiencing their childhood, if we take all these risk factors, all this abuse and everything that is happening to a child, then we are fostering and empowering children to live and enjoy their childhood, but also enabling them to develop to their full potential and be able to give back to the society.
I think there's sometimes a tendency in this ultra and hyper competitive world to want to make sure that every minute of a child's day is structured and organized, and that kids are always being pushed to learn Mandarin or Shakespearean English or the latest programming language for the computer. But sometimes just leaving a child to play is just as powerful. Kids need to explore. They need to be able to light their curiosity and just find out what's out there. It comes down, I think, to that title of that novel or that book that was making the rounds, Eat, Play, and Love.
Right.
These are three things that a child really, really needs. Let's make sure our kids have access to good nutrition, structured and time to play, and of course a loving parental relationship. That's what a child needs.
And we have come to the end of our show. I feel that's a good place to end it. Thank you so much for joining us today on the show. And we wish you all the best for your upcoming
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good to be here.
That's all we have for you on the show tonight. We'll be back next week. Good evening.